There hasn't necessarily been uh, no worries. um, yes, so some of the things have been recorded before. Some haven't, and it's just connecting them all together. But the idea was to have a full maritime only data set of all the heritage within the Firth of Forth. We're also then looking at using that information to identify areas with potential for currently unrecorded maritime archaeology, particularly wrecks, particularly those that are wooden wrecks. Um, we're also looking to work with members of the community all around the Forth to provide them with skills in terms of archaeological recording, in terms of map progression, looking back through and finding places that might be of interest to them, and confidence in using those skills. And part of the project, the reason the Seafarers Charity are funding it is because we're also particularly working with current and retired mariners as a way to combat isolation and promote good mental health, so that sort of thing. So that's the project running at the moment. That is one of the project maps that has been being added to over the last 6 months or so by participants, adding in the maritime heritage that they know about within their area, or going and finding new um, heritage to record using historic maps. And I suppose the main thing is to sort of start thinking about what is maritime heritage to you. Is it just shipwrecks? Is it just history of navigation? Um, but it's not. There's a lot more to it than just the sort of images on there of sailing or ships and navigation elements. It's also buildings on land related to the construction and operation and repair of ships. That can be operational things like harbours, piers, jetties, breakwaters, all the way through to the artifacts that reach our shores put on ships or are exported by vessels, all connect into the maritime trade networks. Um, all those specific materials that are used by crews and mariners throughout throughout history. And of course, it's the people themselves who operate on vessels, who work at sea or play at sea, and also the contacts in around the world that they make, their families, their friends, their loved ones, all around the place, that sort of all connect together through the maritime sphere. And it's also certainly much more than just the last century or the modern time. Um, movement within Scotland in particular, but all over Western Europe, by what is key to how people get around during a period when there are very few roads, very little on land infrastructure, and it's quite difficult to certainly move around in large amounts of material on land. So you start to sort of see people shifting towards using the sea far more. Certainly, early movement by water is vitally important to opening up Scotland to human occupation. We see the movement of people up the North Sea coasts in relatively early time periods. The earliest site is on the headwaters of the Tweed, where they're almost certainly using the river as a route way through and up into the southern lowlands, and then along the coastlines, moving up into our the Clyde and Argyll, with some very early sites in the Hebrides as well. A lot of this would be using um, artifacts like logboats or coracles, sewn plank boats like the Dover Bronze Age boat there, which don't necessarily survive particularly well, or only survive in very specific burial conditions, which means that there are relatively few surviving examples to tell us what they look like and how they worked, apart from those that have been preserved within usually soft mud or peats. As you sort of move up in the move through time, you start to see the advent of larger vessels, particularly with the Roman occupation of southern Britain, but also with trade and exchange coming through. The Roman forts on the Forth at Cramond at the eastern end of the Antonine Wall and at Inveresk near Musselburgh are very important to the relatively brief Roman occupation of southern Scotland, but then all the way through into the early medieval period and very important connections in the medieval trading routes between the Forth and the North Sea, all the way through to Spanish Armada and the War of the Three Kingdoms, seeing large numbers of relatively sizable vessels and their crews coming up and anchoring and being around in the Forth in general. So the Forth has always been one of the gateways into Scotland. As I say, evidence for Roman shipping at Cramond and Inveresk in the southern Forth. They tend to like using river mouths as places to anchor and places to stop, and that also tends to be where they build their forts because they're useful, relatively safe places for those vessels to anchor. They haven't necessarily got the best ability to stay offshore too far. You also have quite extensive movement of monks and religious buildings, religious buildings set up all the way up the eastern seaboard of what was at that point the Kingdom of Bernicia, with monasteries at Oldham, Coldringham, and then even further up beyond the Forth, up to places like Port Mahomac in Cromarty. Very important early ferry traffic across the Forth. Bear in mind that there were no bridges, and ferry traffic was very, very important. But actually, the Forth is very much the motorway of its time. Again, linking people rather than splitting people up. Relatively simple to cross the Forth, or at least relatively available crossings. If you think about ferry traffic going from North Berwick to Earls Ferry in Fife, or from Queen's Ferry north to south. Both early established ferries that are doing a roaring trade within the early Med and later later medieval period. And it's also a point where you get large scale invading forces, whether that's English, French, or during the brief John Paul Jones attack on Dunbar as part of the American War of Independence and Napoleonic Wars as well. It's also been a route out into the world for Scotland, particularly whether that's economically or socially. You've got large-scale ship construction in places like Alloa, Leith, and Bo'ness, amongst many others. Fishing vessels being constructed in many other smaller ports, particularly in the East Neuk around Anster and Selladyke. Large numbers, and St Monans, large numbers of vessels being built there are being used throughout the North Sea and North Atlantic. Whaling ships and whaling companies, some of the earliest ones in Scotland are set up in Anstruther and Leith. Bo'ness and Dunbar are also having some important whaling ships operating from there in the relatively early period when the whaling industry in the North Atlantic is still dominated by the Basques and the Dutch. Scotland is pushing into that before eventually England takes over for a little bit until the Dundee whalers become particularly predominant in the mid-19th century. And if we move up towards the modern day, ferries and passenger lines coming all the way across the North Sea, very important shipping companies based out of Leith, based out of Methil and Leven, and based out of Grangemouth as well. Some very large, significant cargo lines like the Ben Line, but also the whaling fleet of Christian Salverson out of Leith as well. And all the way through to now, you still have a smaller number of large ports operating, as I'm sure you see with the relatively sizable vessels coming in and out of Grangemouth, Leith, and Methil as well. So what we're currently looking at doing, or what we have been doing for the last 6 months, is identifying the coastal maritime features visible on historic mapping. This is using the National Library of Scotland's freely available historic maps, which are all on their maps website. There'll be a link to that at the end of this presentation. And some of those have been geo-referenced, so you know exactly where they are. Some are just individual maps on their own. They also have a large collection of historic charts, estate maps, other fantastic records that are all really useful for identifying where features may or may not be, particularly within the last 200 years, but also then they may well be recording stuff further back. You have decent-ish mapping all the way back to the Roy's Survey of Scotland in the late 1740s, early 1750s. While it's not necessarily the most detailed, it does show you that there's stuff going on in various places, and it does sort of show harbours where they are. While this material is on land, it is still part of maritime history. These are the features that allow the operation of vessels, whether that's landing points, construction points, and operational points, or structures that enable the processing of maritime materials, or allow the materials that go together to make vessels. It also includes things like navigational aids, whether that's lighthouses or beacons. The Forth contains the earliest, or has the earliest lighthouse in Scotland on the Isle of May, which is operational from, I think, the 1650s, maybe the 1630s, a bit earlier. But very important to mark where navigational hazards are from a relatively early point, particularly as charts are expensive and not particularly well shared. So you do start to see a lot more navigational hazards being put in as ships get bigger and as the expense of possibly losing their ships gets ever higher. We'll talk more about the history of navigational aids within the Forth next week. So a very quick touch on that. What we're using as our base map for the study is the OS second edition. So that's published. They are surveyed and published in the 1890s. But there are also earlier maps. So the first edition OS is 1850s. You have then got some earlier maps which show different bits and bobs throughout there. And then we have the NLS has maps going all the way through to the 1970s, essentially coming up to when they run out of copyright. So we can use a lot of different maps to compare the development of different ports, different harbours, and see where activity is going on. And that's part of the point of the project is to map the level of maritime activity that we can see on shore as a proxy for the amount of maritime activity there would therefore be within the proximity to that port or that area. So one of the first things, obviously, that we think about is shipbuilding and boat building, because you can't have maritime activity without boats, without ships in some capacity. And the Forth is a major boat building and shipbuilding location. It's not just about the shipbuilding yards themselves. It's not just about the slipways and the graving docks that are necessary for building the ships. It's also about the ancillary materials that they want for those things. A lot of those things have to be imported as raw materials, held in a yard of some kind, and then processed into the material you want to build the ship with, whether that is timber coming from the Baltic, which again demonstrates a clear maritime connection, Scotland having removed large amounts of its timber during the medieval period for building houses and ships of its own. You see very early connections between shipyards in the Forth and the Baltic ports, who are exporting large amounts of oak and fir and larch. You also then have things like rigging, the materials to make the rigging, and the materials to waterproof vessels, so caulking and tar, both being very important for that. You also find that you need space to build those ships, because ships tend to be fairly sizable vessels, some of the most complex pieces of individual items around. So you tend to find shipbuilding yards towards the edges of these post-medieval settlements, and unsurprisingly, you tend to find them on watercourses or to the sea. So this is one of the shipbuilding yards at Alloa in the 18. When's that from? First edition 25-inch map from, I think, roughly 1870. I believe maybe 1860 for that one. But yeah, you start to see it's only got one graving dock, but it has got that's the bit to the edge of the crane to the right of the crane. There will be the launch slipway for the where they're building the ships, and then they'll launch them, bring them onto the graving dock to be fitted out and then commissioned. And you have a whole range of different connected industries, mostly to do with timber processing, which is one of the most important things at that point when you're building most of your ships out of wood. Those boatyards are developing from the medieval period onwards. You start to see more of a need for centralizing materials into the same place, and as you get larger and more complex ships. This is a southern English example. This is one of the earliest large-scale royal dockyards in England, down in Smallhithe in Kent, where you have relatively early slipways, but also early dry docks being dug into the side of what is now dry land, ever since they drained large chunks of marshes in the south of Kent. You do also get some fairly sizable excavated docks, and the fourth example would be the royal docks at possibly at Higgins Nuke or Erith, on the south side of the Forth, on the south side of the Kincardine Bridge, which have not been fully located by archaeological studies. They are thought to be there. It's where the Great Michael is sent after she's built in Newhaven. But you do have these relatively early, large-scale docklands coming up in the sort of 1500s, 1600s, and then developing into the larger scale shipyards that we see in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. Uh, Early on, they're largely building clinker construction vessels. That's where the hull planking overlaps each other, and they're held together with rivets and roves along the overlaps, and then the framing goes in afterwards to stiffen up the shape of the boat. But a lot of the shape of the boat is it's dictated by the plank shape and how they connect together. This uses an awful lot of iron, which is expensive. It also uses, oddly, more timber than carvel construction, which is what we'll talk about in a minute. So it tends to be one of the reasons they shift away from clinker construction is because carvel construction is much more efficient in terms of the amount of wood you need. But it is very strong and it is very effective. This is sort of Viking ship style construction, you can see there. But you do get them used all the way up to about 30-40 meters worth of length. That top example is a wreck that we worked on in the Baltic. It was built in about 1700, I believe, and that's about 30 meters long. So you do get some fairly sizable vessels, but 30-40 meters is about the limit of what you can build. So when you want to build larger ships, you have to shift to carvel, which is when planks are edge to edge and sort of smooth along the outer part of the hull. This first comes out of Southern English and Dutch construction in the 1500s, which is in its turn is actually coming out of the Mediterranean. It's sort of introduced to England by Genoese shipwrights, who are brought in by Henry VIII to construct vessels for his fleet for his wars against France, and slowly develops over the course of time into much larger vessels, the sort of largest size naval and merchant marine vessels that we see in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. Usually built on purpose-built slipways, partly because they're much larger and they are much heavier, and because you need things to be flat and nice and straight to actually be able to construct them properly without causing issues, which does mean that they then have to have a larger space to be constructed in. So you start to see you need more space and more materials. Again, why you tend to find these shipyards on the edge of towns or on the edge of built-up areas, as opposed to in the middle of them, because you just can't fit them in. That's not necessarily true in Leith. There are a couple of shipyards right in the middle of Leith during the 16th, 17th century and later on, but that's also just because there was some spare land there to be used. The materials you need for ships, you also need your timbers for your planking, your framing. Keel tend to want to have relatively large, sizable vessels, ship timbers, and of the right type, whether that is oak, which a lot of the large vessels are made out of, but they do make large vessels out of softwoods. Things like larch and fir are used particularly in the Baltic or exported from the Baltic to make ships in Scotland as well. Your caulking material, whether that's hemp or jute, and then the tar over the top of it to make it nice and watertight. You also need iron for keel bolts and nails if you're using them. A lot of French shipbuilding uses a lot more iron nails than the English and Dutch shipbuilding, and Scottish shipbuilding as well, which means they can build quicker, but it tends to also destroy the ships quicker because you get iron sick in the wood, and it causes the wood to break down more quickly. So in English and Dutch shipbuilding design, they use these things called trennels, which are basically just wooden dowels holding the two pieces of planks, the two inner and outer planks, and together across the framing, and they swell up in the water and make everything very, very strong. Also, you're looking at additional parts for ships, so you want your masts and spars, whether that is large dug fir spars in the case of something like the Reaper at Scottish Fisheries Museum, or whatever other form of long straight timber you can get. Potentially need your sail material as well, whatever material you're using for that, whether that's wool or hemp or cotton. I think it's about the material you need for rigging. And then as we go into the 19th century, looking at materials for engines and winches and the support industries that construct and repair those, all of which will have connections to the maritime world. and then whoever's making your paint, tar, and consumables for your fleet as well tends to be within the same sort of area because it's easy for accessibility, at least at the start, and then it develops up to where you see larger scale businesses and economies of scale coming in. So initially, particularly in the East Nuke, we see village or town yards for small coastal vessels. Huge amount of fishing vessels built in Seldyke, Anster, St Monans sort of areas, and a huge number of yards operating out those places. Not necessarily all at the same time, but certainly over the course of the 19th and 20th century, I think Seldyke Trust has found something like 80 different yards operating within Seldyke and Anster just in that period. It may well be that one builds just one boat on spec, or one may be building something like Miller's at St Monans, building hundreds of vessels over the course of their operational time. These tend to be building either for that community or building for other fishing communities, whether that is in Scotland or more widely abroad, more widely afield. Certainly, Seldyke is building vessels for the Isle of Man quite a lot in the 1930s and 40s, 50s. Tend to be backyard or foreshore locations close to the harbour, so they can easily drop them into the harbour and get them launched and away. And like I said, they may only produce a small number of vessels, or they may produce loads. What we tend to find over the course of the 19th century, in particular, 18th century to the 19th century, is you end up with your smaller scale industries, associated industries in each town. So whether that's rope works, sailcloth manufacturers, small scale industries that are all allied to and close to the shipbuilding yards, the boat building yards. Often you find, particularly in fishing towns and villages, you'll find barking pots for tarring your nets and tying your ropes. They tend to be all gone because as soon as you stop needing tar to waterproof your ropes, they're completely pointless and they get removed. They also tend to, interestingly, be in a lot of the examples I've seen so far, they're very close to the town gasworks as well, and that's probably because they're using coal tar, byproduct of the creation of coal gas, as a very cheap source of tar rather than using imported material. These are across the whole study area, so we're seeing even small villages that are very close together. Cockenzie, Port Seaton will have their own barking pots and their own industries supporting their fleet, at least in the 19th century. And then as things become more centralized and economies of scale grow, you sort of start to see these different smaller industries closing down and larger scale works centralizing to one or two places across the region. So we start to see the start of docklands. Those are the two big shipbuilding yards in Leith I was talking about. One of which is still sort of there. You can see the outline of the dry dock just above the word harbour, still within that bit of Leith. They've left it. It's just been filled in and grassed over, but they haven't put a house on it because it's a relatively deep thing full of relatively soft stuff. I think houses don't enjoy being put on that sort of stuff. But you do see the development of larger vessels means that you no longer can just pull your vessels up onto the foreshore as you would with a kayak or with a canoe. You need, or with a relatively small vessel, you need to start having actual formal docklands, quaysides, and wharves to enable your ships to be safely loaded and unloaded. And you start to see the development of dry docks, particularly due to the need for repairing carvel vessels, which are less keen on being hauled out and worked on or just on the beach. And alongside that, we see continuing the development of much larger yards for much larger ships, again bringing together all of the different things they need to have nearby. That's at Granton in the southwest corner of Granton Harbour, which is now entirely covered with flats and houses. You have a very large shipbuilding yard, ship repair yard, haul out slip. You also have a rope mill, rope works there. Sawmills are related to the construction of the production of timber, partly to repair and build ships in that shipbuilding yard. And previously separate industries are all brought in-house or often brought in-house to those yards as well. Yeah. Okay, I need to stop saying things before I bring the slide up. But economies of scale all comes through. You have the centralization, particularly of rope making. You go from having roughly 30 to 40 different rope works all around the Forth, down to just having two major ones: Edinburgh Rope and Sail in Leith, and the Union Ropery to the south of Kirkcaldy. Um, Neither of which are particularly visible anymore. You can tell where the Edinburgh one was because every single road that is now flats has got a rope-based name within that bit of Leith. I think where the Union Ropery used to be is now a big Tesco or an Asda just south of Kirkcaldy. These industries tend to be quite difficult, or they tend to not be able to easy to see within the modern landscape, but you can spot them sometimes because they are an odd shape of building, and then when stuff gets built around them when they're still operational, that odd shape stays as a fossil within the street structure within a town. So, for instance, there's a couple in Leven and a couple in Anstruther that have remained as sort of long, thin strips within the town map that you can sort of spot if you're looking for them. So it's worth having a wee look. They're not all that visible from the sea, sadly, so it's more difficult to see if you're paddling. But they are there. We also see extensive import of raw materials, as I've said, from the Baltic, in particular with timber yards. Timber bush in Edinburgh comes from the French timber bouche, which is the French word for a market or a selling point. Large amounts of timber being brought in there. It's interesting. You can sort of tell how well the economy is going in Scotland by how much timber they're importing. If they're importing lots of timber, the economy is going well because they're building lots of stuff. If they're not importing much timber, then things are not looking great. Also have large amounts of flax mills, particularly in places like Dundee, but they're not in the Forth, and the base, all working to producing material that is then used within maritime activities, but it's also brought in largely by ships. And one of the major things that's being moved around within the Forth is coal, whether that is coming out of the relatively small harbours in which tend to be harbours of barony, which we'll talk about in a wee bit, or whether that is being exported out of the major coal exporting harbours like Burnt Island, Methil, Leith, Bo'ness. Start to see technological changes over the course of time. Wire rope starts to take over from just normal ropes. So we start to see things like wire mills, particularly large, huge wire mill being built at Musselburgh in the late 19th century. And again, then you sort of see connections with engine houses. Steam power comes in. The technology of how you're building and what you're using to build ships changes. So we start to see more iron foundries, more plate rolling mills, and the associated industries with those sort of things that are all connected to maritime heritage, maritime history through these links start to sort of show up within the mapping. That's all the structures connected with construction of maritime of ships and boats. We then think about structures associated with maritime operations. So this is just all the things that ships are doing during their working life. You obviously have lots of different landing points or import points, whether that's ship jetties or slipways, harbours, quaysides, and the storehouses and docklands that enable those materials to be stored and kept safe for a bit. Then you've also got things connected to the crews themselves, whether that's seamless hostels, customs houses, fish markets, the materials that are being brought in and traded from the sea. And then again, we have the navigational aids that stop the ships, hopefully, from wrecking or being taken by different hazards around the place. If we have a quick look at the harbours of the Forth, this is it's a generalisation, which means it's not entirely true. Within the inner Forth, so from sort of Leith inward westwards, a lot of the harbours, the majority of the harbours are for the export of extracted raw materials from the hinterland behind them, whether that's coal or lime or stone caught from the quarries, and an import of materials specifically to support those extractive industries. There are ones that are not that, and there are harbours further out that are to do with that. But the majority of harbours in the inner Forth are to do with those things. And then within the outer Forth, the majority of the harbours are more related to fishing industries and or transport. That's not to say that's all they do. They are also importing materials. So Crail is importing large amounts of material there as a royal borough. But it also is heavily based around the fishing industries and the transport of people to and from St Andrews. Early export harbours within the Forth have relatively minimal infrastructure that we can still see, but I think there is quite a lot there if you are that's subtle. And the more I spend paddling about in the intertidal, the more I find in various places, and the more I'm keen to get out and do more kayaking and going looking at isolated rocks and this sort of stuff to see whether there's anything on those as well, because I think there will be. And it's an area that has not been looked at very much in the past. But I think there's a lot of information there about navigational aids within the Forth that is currently being missed. But anyway, yes, generally what you can see now is relatively small scale, relatively minimal. It's rough stone piers, wooden jetties across the tidal flats, enabling ships to come in, beach on the come in at high tide, low tide. Tide goes out, they beach, they get filled up or the material removed from them, and then tide comes in again and they leave. They're exporting they're comparatively small ships. They're exporting comparatively small amounts of material, but it's still much more efficient than trying to send that material wherever it wants to go on land, particularly if you're on the north side of the Forth and you're trying to take it to the south side of the Forth. It's a long, long way for stuff that's not got legs. You're still seeing a lot of droving of cattle and other domesticated animals, but then taking it up to the ferries on the upper Forth. But in terms of heavy material that you want to shift around, you're going to be using it, taking it as quickly as you can to the coast and then putting it onto a boat. And that's also true of agricultural export as well. The East Lothian, West Lothian, Fife bread baskets are exporting a huge amount of agricultural produce. When they have surplus, they do also have periods of quite heavy famine throughout the medieval and post-medieval period as well. We also find early on these little beach harbours, which are largely for fisheries. So that's the boat shore at Cairnsey. What these are sort of small breaks in some of the intertidal rocks that then enable a small, reasonably protected but not superbly protected area for you to pull your boats up and keep them safe there. There's also some at East Weems, the haven, and the small harbour at London as well. These are generally mapped as names. You can find them via the names mapped on them. So there's things like Port Haven at Donnybristle and a few other bits and bobs there, which are clear signs of early landing places, early havens, but they're not very safe. If a storm comes through, then if your boat's in the boat shore and you haven't moved it, then it will be in pieces by the end of it. So you do start to see people just starting to need to construct more defensive harbours to protect their vessels, but as their vessels become more of a sizable investment and more of a problem if they lose them. Over the course of the late medieval into the post-medieval, so that's 15, 16, 17, 1800s, there is an ongoing battle between royal boroughs and boroughs of barony. Royal boroughs have permission from the crown to conduct international trade, and they pay taxes based on that to the crown. Boroughs of barony are not allowed to do international trade. They're entirely restricted to internal trading, so they can take their material to a royal borough for international trade, or they can trade it there, but then they have to pay import taxes on it twice. Makes it much less tempting. But you tend to find a lot of these boroughs of baronies being set up by large landowners because they need to they want to exploit the resources they have on their land that they are using the local population to extract and remove. And they want to make as much money as they can out of that. So they are constructing these relatively small harbours to enable ships to get to their material to get onto ships and go somewhere else. Otherwise, it's just sat in the ground doing nothing. It opens up in the 18th century after a lot of lobbying from the rich landowners, and the rich landowners tend to get their own way in the end, leading to developments of those burghs of barony becoming larger, becoming more extensive. Particularly thinking of someone like Charleston in Fife at the moment, which becomes a huge mass exporter of lime globally. In fact, it's sending lime to Halifax in Canada at some points because it's such high quality material. They've managed to tell people it's such high quality material that they're able to export it across the Atlantic to build structures within Halifax in the 18th century. And West Wemyss, particularly with coal, a lot of the Fife harbours are heavily industrial materials, coal and lime and stone. During this point, again, as the ships get larger, the material gets more complicated. We start to see the development of some navigational aids. I'll go into this in more detail next week. But they need to start being more careful about not hitting rocks and not hitting other things. And there's a great amount of traffic coming in and out of the Forth. So also people who don't necessarily know the area very well. The Forth is not a compulsory pilot, or hasn't been. Certainly wasn't at this point a compulsory pilotage area. So you could, if you didn't want to, come and sail up the Forth without taking a pilot on. And so what they needed to do was identify where those hazards were and tell people and show people where they were. This is the base of a beacon or of some kind of navigational aid that is in the middle of Torrey Bay in Fife, just south of Torrey Burn. And I'm fairly sure that there's a whole series of features within that bay that are enabling ships to come in and tie up just under the Kirk or under the road from the Kirk, which also happens to be the road where they were bringing a lot of coal down from the mines, and they're coming in there and loading up. But this was recognised before, but wasn't fully recorded. So one of the things this project's done is gone and recorded that. We're slowly working along, particularly the Fife Coast, looking for other examples of these, because I think they're quite interesting, and they are an under-recorded feature within the Forth that also enables us to understand better how people are moving around within this area. Slowly, over the course of the 18th and 19th century, we get better transport links on land, increased trade in the second half of the 18th century in particular due to better road links. You start to see more toll roads. You start to see the development of an actual road network. Prior to the late 18th century, the vast majority of material within Edinburgh was actually being moved around by sled because it was less jolty than taking a cart across the terrible roads that continue to exist within Edinburgh. But so you had to go on sleds to ensure that your bottles of port that you were bringing in from Portugal didn't smash on the way. But the development of turnpikes and other road systems means that carts do actually start to replace those sleds over the course of the land transport. You also get the development of wagonways, the recreation of the Cockenzie to Trent one there with fellow archaeologist Alan Braby in his best 18th century costume, which enables you to move lots more material quickly and efficiently from the hinterland down to ports and vice versa, going the other way. Particularly these are in the coalfields. In Clackmannanshire and bits of Fife, they're called tramways. I'm not entirely sure what the difference is apart from the spelling. They are basically the same thing. But you do start to see these developments, and it means you have large amount of material of stuff that can be moved around. Start to see the Industrial Revolution coming to harbours, again, more material being shifted around, so you have to start developing more efficient loading methods because you have more ships coming in, more ships sitting out in the roads waiting to load, and if they're waiting too long, they'll just go to a different port. You have lots of options for where you go and either unload or load your material, and the more time you spend waiting on the roads, waiting to come in, is the more time you'll lose, more money you're losing. So ports start to compete to bring in shipping. They start to develop more efficient ways of loading, more efficient ways of bringing ships in. They get bigger, so they have more berths, so they can get more ships in. It's one of the big things about the development of the Port of Leith is the need for more and more berths because they're losing custom to Grangemouth and Bowness, and in some cases actually weirdly to Dundee, particularly once the railways come in, because you can move material more efficiently and more effectively. And ships are larger, so they need more deeper water to come in and operate and be unloaded and loaded as well. So here we can see there's a lot of pictures of Cockenzie. We've done a lot of work at Cockenzie, but it is a very interesting little harbour because of that. These are some of the coal tips that were developed at this point, actually not by the Stevensons, although that is a drawing by Stevenson. He asks the owner of Cockenzie Harbour if he can have a look at his coal tip mechanism so he can draw it and then take it to Alloa, because Alloa are very interested in having more coal tips as well. But you can see these sort of like drawbridge style things where you put your cart in and then it sort of tips it forward and the coal flows off into the boat. It's very effective. It's all just using gravity. Prior to that, you just got people shoveling things in. As an example, is how we just talked about Leith. This is sort of Leith in 1777. Got a relatively small piece of wharfage here, and actually, your majority of your wharfage in Leith is on the two sides of the water of Leith. And so, if there's not space in that little bit, then your ship has to wait out in the roads until you can come in. This is a plan of what they want to do in 1807. These two wet docks do get eventually constructed, almost bankrupting the city of Edinburgh, who at that point owns Leith, the Port of Leith, and they don't build this larger two wet docks, which goes all the way up to Newhaven. And in fact, they then ignore Newhaven and don't do anything about it until the early 20th century, when they start to actually build a larger amount of Leith docks. But this was the plan. They knew they needed much more wharfage. They needed much more space for ships. They are really starting to look at, we're losing a lot of money to other harbours and we're losing a lot of material. Bit of a jump, but yes, it's not just about the harbours and not just about the bits. There's also lots of other industries you can spot along the way, whether that is industries for the products of the sea, so things like processing whale oil. This is at Kirkcaldy. You've got a huge whale oil manufacturer at Kirkcaldy. And then the cooperage, the barrel makers that are necessary for processing the bits of whale at sea to then bring back and boil down within the whale oil factory. Fish markets and ice houses are also very important for slightly more less whale-based activities. And these all sort of cluster around the harbours and ports, so it's all sort of connected up there. And then finally, industries for mariners themselves. So you have oilskin factories, a big oilskin factory in Cellardyke in Fife, and then there's also one in Preston Pans, which are creating large amounts of these new fabrics using material being made in Dundee or nearby, and then waterproofing them. And these have become a global industry for this part of Scotland. So they have a wide reach. People are wearing Butex fabric garments all over the world, and they're exported all over the place, including things like making inflatable buoys and that sort of stuff, when that factory also made them. And then you also have things like net makers. There's a huge net factories. The Cardiff Networks Lower Largo is an important one, but you have massive networks on the Esk at Musselburgh as well. And all of these industries tie into the maritime heritage. Even if you're working in one of those factories, you're part of the maritime heritage of the Forth. So even if you're not going to sea, you are still part of all those important maritime links. And I think that's like the story I want to tell from this, is that it's maritime heritage is everywhere in the Forth because it's such an important waterway, and there's so much stuff being produced, both from material for the sea, but also for maritime occupations, that essentially almost everybody is touched by maritime heritage in some capacity throughout the Forth's history. If you want to see more of this sort of stuff, and you want to go in when you're going and planning a paddling trip, these are some links that are useful. PassMap is has a large amount of different information on it to do with the historic environment. You can go and see what's in an area you're going to. It will be lots of dots on a map, and they don't necessarily tell you what the different dots are until you click on them. But it's well worth having a look at somewhere you want to go. Trove is Hess's replacement for Canmore, which was the National Historic Environment Record. PassMap will link you to Trove to show you where the records are, but you can also go and look at Trove and its map feature through its website. I prefer PassMap because it layers everything a bit more easily, but Trove is improving and is a bit better now. National Library of Scotland's historic maps and charts is fantastic. A lot of all this work is being done through the historic maps and charts. And again, if you're interested in going and seeing what the area you're paddling around looked like before, it's well worth going and having a look at them, what they've got there. They've got charts going back to the 1500s, I think. They're not particularly useful, but they are interesting to look at. And then some of the Victorian charts are fascinating because you tend to find they are recording things like transits and saying, right, okay, if you can see these two things on a line, then you're here. And again, we'll go into that more next week when we're talking about the history navigation, but there's some lovely stuff there. You've also got, that's an unintelligible web address, but I can get the guys to send this round to everyone after the thing. That's the mapping that we've done, or that the participants on this project have done so far. We also have an ongoing open map where people can add things to in terms of navigational hazards and navigational aids, and if anyone wants to get involved in that, it'd be wonderful to have more people adding stuff to that. And then the guys at Scape, which does a lot of work with coastal erosion and archaeology. They have a map of different sites that are currently at risk, particularly from coastal erosion all around Scotland, but the ones in the Firth are within our study area. So they're all good places to go and look for this information. And I'll pass that link on to Charlotte, or those links on to Charlotte to send around to everyone for your interest. And a final plug for the second one of these sessions, which is going to be looking at the history of navigation within the Firth of Forth. So how people know where they are and have known where they are over the course of the last, we'll say 2,000 years. I'm not necessarily going to limit it to that or go all the way back to that, but it'll be somewhere around there. And yes, thank you very much for watching this and listening to me blather on for a long time. That's my email address if anyone wants to get in touch. Be very happy to have anyone else be involved with the project. We're running for, technically, I think we're running till October, but we're probably going to run through to January at this point, just because people are still getting involved with the project. People are still adding things to it, so it's not a massive problem for us to continue it a little bit further. But yeah, thank you all very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ben. Yeah, that was great. And I can't wait to listen into part two next week. So I'll give a little pause in case anyone has any questions that they want to ask. Feel free to put your hand up or come off of mute or make use of the chat box. But yeah, I'm happy to share the link. I'll stop recording now as well. And I can